In the late 29th or early 30th millennium, the emperor inscribed arcane glyphs of protection onto each of 20 gestation capsules housed deep under the Himalazian Mountains on Terra. The wards existed for one precise reason. Whatever he was growing inside those capsules burned so brightly in the immaterium that chaos could perceive them through several kilometers of rock and the most heavily fortified architecture in human civilization. The protective glyphs weren't caution, they were necessity. Without them, the Ruinous Powers would reach the Primarchs before birth. That single fact is the foundation of the strongest argument against the Null Primarch theory, and the argument is worth building honestly before anything else happens, because it's not confused. It's not a misconception about how 40K works. It's technically precise, internally consistent, and it attacks not the evidence for the theory, but the structural possibility of the thing the theory describes. The argument goes like this. If the reason those gestation capsules needed psychic shielding is that the Primarchs glowed in the immaterium from before birth, if the property making them extraordinary is inseparable from their warp constitution, then a Null Primarch, a Primarch with no warp presence, isn't a weakened version of the standard model. It's a contradiction in terms, a body without the entity that defines it. To understand why that argument is as powerful as it is, and where exactly it breaks down, you have to start with what a Primarch actually is at the metaphysical level. Guy Haley's Darkness in Blood provides the most compact formulation in the Black Library canon. Primarchs are engineered warp entities placed in supremely crafted biological vessels. Every other lore source builds outward from that core. The Primarchs contained a sliver of the warp. It flowed in their veins and made them hybrids between advanced genetic science and warp sorcery. The biological architecture is the vessel. The warp entity is the Primarch. Spend a moment with what that means in practice, because the implications run further than most debates acknowledge. Rabute Gilliman, the most rational and methodical of the 20, the one who built the Codex Astartes and administered Ultramar like a Roman province, his ability to inspire absolute loyalty in 1,000,000 space marines simultaneously doesn't come from charisma in any conventional psychological sense. Magnus the Red's capacity to rewrite local physics with a thought, Sanguinius holding the walls of Baal against things that should have overrun him 10 times before the Blood Angels even reached the walls. All of it flows from the same source. The sliver of immaterium burning inside each Primarch like a small star in the psychic plane. The Emperor knew this, in detail, from the moment of conception. He inscribed those protective glyphs precisely because the warp component that made the Primarchs what they were also made them reachable. Souls that shine brightly in the immaterium are, by definition, souls that chaos can perceive, track, and eventually work through. The Emperor's arcane shielding was designed to delay that exposure, not eliminate the vulnerability. He couldn't eliminate it. The vulnerability was the same property as the power. Every one of the 20 carried that vulnerability without exception, and the heresy is the document of how chaos exploited it. Lorgar was reached through faith, through the word-bearer's desperate need for meaning after Monarchia. Chaos emissaries found the theological wound the Emperor had torn open and worked through it. Magnus through pride and the conviction that love justified breaking the council of Nicaea's edicts, tearing open the Emperor's own psychic wards in the process. Angron through pain, the butcher's nails installed in his skull before the Emperor ever reached Nuceria, an existing wound that chaos had centuries to deepen. Each corrupted Primarch became reachable through a different vector, but the access point was always the same, the immaterium presence that chaos could perceive and apply pressure to over years and decades of patient, subtle work. James Swallow's Fear to Tread records what Sanguinius understood about this mechanism. When Horus asked why the angel hadn't sought the Emperor's help with the genetic flaw emerging in the Blood Angels, Sanguinius rounded on him. refusing to risk the Blood Angels becoming a third empty plinth beneath the roof of the hegemon, another legion erased from imperial history. Third, already 2 empty plinths, already 2 legions gone before that conversation happened. Sanguinius knew, had worked out, that the empty plinths and his own legion's survival were connected by the same mechanism, the warp-bright nature of a Primarch genome, and what happened when that nature produced something the Emperor couldn't afford the Imperium to know about. Lore synthesis of the Heresy novels suggests the warp component wasn't even generic across all 20. For at least some Primarchs, particular warp presences or energies were specifically bound during creation, 20 different variations on the same mechanism, each adapted to a different substrate. The Emperor wasn't pouring undifferentiated immaterium into identical vessels and calling it done. He was doing something precise, individual, and deeply technical. Each Primarch's warp constitution was engineered to a specific configuration. Now place a blank against that architecture. A blank is an exceedingly rare type of human mutant who possesses no presence in the warp. The Lexicanum classifies them at omega minus on the psychic scale, not the bottom of the scale, below it, below detectable. The definition carries a second component that most debates skip past. It isn't passive absence alone. A blank soul actively attacks and nullifies the warp presences around it. Their brains don't merely fail to generate an immaterium signal. They actively blot the warp out within their proximity, disrupting psychic phenomena in their vicinity and rendering them immune to psychic powers. That active negation has documented consequences at the highest levels of warp-constituted being. The Siege of Terra novels establish what happens when a fully empowered greater demon, entities like Kugath, a demon of Nurgle operating at near-peak manifestation during the siege, comes into proximity with a Null Maiden's aura. Kugath acknowledged explicitly that death by a sister's hand was true death, not banishment back to the immaterium, not dissolution with the prospect of remanifestation over centuries. Annihilation. Permanent ending. A being whose entire nature and existence is constituted by warp substance finds that a blank's aura doesn't suppress its power. It erodes the thing it fundamentally is. Apply that mechanism to a Primarch, an engineered warp entity, something whose defining nature is constituted by its immaterium presence. A blank's active negation field wouldn't interact neutrally with a Primarch's warp content. The field doing the nullifying would be attacking the component that makes the Primarch a Primarch, not a weakened version of the original. An active self-contradiction, collapsing. This is where the objection to the Null Primarch theory earns its weight. The warp soul mechanism and the blank mechanism aren't simply different, they're antagonistic. Placing them in the same vessel under the same design philosophy doesn't produce a strange hybrid. It produces a system at war with itself, one that destroys the very thing it was intended to be. So debates around the theory keep hitting this wall. The evidence for the Null Primarch, the timing of the expungements, the extraordinary thoroughness of the suppression, the sorrow on the Emperor's face when he spoke about the missing brothers, doesn't collapse under scrutiny. But none of that evidence resolves this structural problem, because the structural problem isn't about evidence. It's about whether the thing the theory describes can physically exist within the setting's established rules. The paradoxical nature of it's the specific barrier to belief, not absence of canonical hints, but an apparently insurmountable metaphysical contradiction at the heart of the theory's premise. Here's where the case against the Null Primarch reaches its maximum strength, and where the argument needs to be answered head-on. A Primarch can't be a blank. The two mechanisms are structurally incompatible when combined in the same vessel using the same design philosophy. Accept that completely. Now ask a different question. The Sisters of Silence were founded within 4 solar decades of the Great Crusade's start, formerly the Anathema Psychana, an all-female military order of which every single member possessed the pariah gene, the biological basis of the blank condition, which produces an individual with no warp presence and an active aura of psychic nullification. The Emperor ensured they were all pariahs. That word, ensured, carries operational weight. This wasn't passive recruitment of whoever happened to walk through the door carrying the right genetics. The Emperor ran a deliberate, systematic program of identifying individuals with the pariah gene, selecting them, and building a military institution around their specific biological property. He maintained a standing battalion of the Silent Sisterhood within his personal armies throughout the Great Crusade. The exact numbers of sisters at any given time were known only to the Emperor, not Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's closest advisor, and the most powerful human psyker alive after the Emperor himself. Not the Primarchs, not the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, the personal bodyguard force whose records are among the most comprehensive in imperial history. Him alone. The size and disposition of his blank warrior program was classified information kept by a single individual, which tells you something specific about how the Emperor regarded it. Not a conventional military asset to be accounted for in the standard ledgers, but a strategic reserve under personal control. Their stated mission in official imperial lore was described without ambiguity. Pivotal to the carrying out of the Emperor's great and secret works to contain and limit the influence of the Ruinous Powers. Great and secret works. The Emperor's deepest strategic programs against chaos ran specifically through a blank warrior force under his personal authority, not through the Astartes legions that everyone knew about, not through the Custodes who served as his public face, but through women with no warp presence operating in the margins of the record. In 004.M31, the sisters were deployed alongside Space Wolves and Adeptus Custodians for the burning of Prospero. Their blank aura was weaponized specifically against the Thousand Suns' psychic capabilities, deployed with deliberate tactical intent against a force whose military power was constituted almost entirely by its warp-working capacity. Leman Russ, the Space Wolves Primarch, described their function without ceremony when asked. That was their function, aside from the fact that they fought like bastards and had the pariah gene in them. A demigod, himself constituted by a warp soul, acknowledging blank warriors as a defined weapons class. The pariah gene isn't a curiosity, it's a military designation, recognized and used at the Primarch level. The Calexis assassin takes that principle further. The Officio Assassinorum's most feared temple doesn't field snipers or infiltrators or shapeshifters. It fields blanks, individuals classified at Omega-, equipped with the Animus Speculum, which the Lexicanum describes without ambiguity, a weapon capable of firing lethal blasts of negative psychic energy. The Imperium has weaponized blank energy into a directed projectile. The absence of warp presence has been concentrated, aimed, and delivered at range. That is in the Lexicanum. Codex confirmed, institutional, not experimental. In the current 41st millennium, Rabute Gilliman's forces have deployed what lore records describe as pariah missiles, orbital-delivered munitions whose payload is infused with the material of blanks and pariahs, extending warp negation effects to strategic range from high orbit. The principle of scaling blank energy from individual proximity to ballistic delivery across hundreds of kilometers has already been worked out and applied in Imperial doctrine. None of this is Primarch equivalent, and that's not the point. The point is that the objection to the Null Primarch relies on an implicit assumption that warp negation as a design property has inherent limits that the Emperor couldn't overcome. What the Sisters of Silence, the Calexis Assassin, and pariah missiles together demonstrate is that the Emperor spent the entirety of his Great Crusade-era strategic planning deliberately developing those limits away, from individual blanks recruited into personal service to an institutionalized military order operating under his sole authority, to weaponized blank energy in projectile form, to orbital delivery. He was scaling warp negation systematically over centuries under the most stringent operational security in Imperial history. The objection asks, can a Primarch be a blank? The mechanism incompatibility answer is no, and it's correct. But the question the objection should be asking is different. Given that this specific individual was personally managing an escalating warp negation program from the early Great Crusade, deploying it against the Ruinous Powers under his sole authority and calling it pivotal to his greatest secret works, what is the specific mechanism preventing him from attempting the next logical iteration of that program? Not combining incompatible mechanisms in the same vessel. Building a new vessel from the ground up around a different substrate. Those aren't the same question. The incompatibility argument answers the first one. The second one requires looking at what the Emperor actually understood about warp physics and at what level. The shadow in the warp is a psychic phenomenon generated by the Tyrannid hive mind that blocks all connections to the immaterium in the local space around a hive fleet, making psychic communications and the manifestation of psychic abilities extremely difficult. The official Warhammer 40,000 wiki describes its arrival precisely. The coming of a Tyrannid hive fleet is preceded by a smothering psychic signal, similar to white noise, that envelops entire star systems. It settles like a vast and terrible pall across countless worlds. Navigators lose the Astronomicon. Astropaths attempting to broadcast go silent or go insane. Psychers who try to reach into the warp through it feel a billion alien thoughts scratching at their minds until they break. Entire star systems cut off simultaneously. No warning, no recourse, no mechanical counter. This requires a precise clarification because the argument depends on precision. The shadow in the warp isn't blank-style null negation. Blanks produce warp disruption through absence, zero warp presence, plus the active aura that attacks surrounding presences. The shadow operates differently. It's the sheer psychic weight of the hive mind's titanic collective consciousness pressing against local warp connections and overwhelming them. Something closer to a DDoS attack on the immaterium's local infrastructure than to a null field. The shadow is very much a warp presence, a consuming, overwhelming one, not an empty one. Different mechanism, different nature, different effect. The relevant point isn't mechanism identity. The relevant point is that warp disruption at the level of multiple star systems simultaneously, warp disruption that isolates entire civilizations, severs interstellar communication, and strips planets of their capacity to call for help before a single Tyrannid warrior makes planetfall, is possible in the 40K setting. And it's produced by a biological collective with no engineering intelligence as an unintended byproduct of existing. No design, no intent, no understanding of what it's doing. Pure biological mass generating interstellar scale warp disruption through zero deliberate effort. If mindless biology produces that effect without trying, the assumption underlying any scale objection to the Null Primarch, that warp-affecting phenomena face inherent size limits that make Primarch scale impossible, has no support in the canon. The Tyrannids don't think about the shadow in the warp. They don't know they're producing it. They simply are what they are, at sufficient scale, and the effect follows automatically. The Emperor thought about everything he built, for decades, using knowledge of warp mechanics that no other being in human history has approached. The Chaos Gods interfered with the Primarch project directly. That much is confirmed in canon. The Ruinous Powers somehow spirited the Emperor's unborn children away through the warp, generating a massive localized warp rift inside the gene vaults beneath the Himalazian Mountains on Terra, the most heavily fortified location in human civilization, and scattered 20 gestation capsules across the galaxy. The word somehow is in the canonical text itself. Even the Imperial record acknowledges it doesn't fully understand the mechanism. That ambiguity is informative on its own, but what the event tells us most specifically is about the Emperor's operating level as perceived by the enemy. The Chaos Gods, entities whose nature spans the entirety of the immaterium, who can perceive the psychic landscape of the material universe in ways that make conventional human understanding look like a man peering at a continent through a keyhole, treated the Primarch project as a threat significant enough to require direct personal intervention at the highest level, not the corruption of a proxy, not the slow nudging of a susceptible human. They reached into Terra's most fortified location and broke open the gene vaults. That isn't the response of beings dealing with an opponent working adjacent to their domain. It's the response of beings who recognized the Emperor was working inside their domain, at something approaching their level, and that what he was building needed to be disrupted before it was finished. The Molech question sits alongside this, and it requires a degree of calibration. Molech is a world the Emperor visited during the Great Crusade, referenced in lore connected to Graham McNeil's vengeful spirit, as the site where the Emperor accessed some form of warp power connected to the Primarch project. The exact nature of what happened there is genuinely contested in the lore, whether it constitutes a bargain, a theft, or something that doesn't map cleanly onto either category isn't resolved by any primary source. Aaron Dembski-Bowden has reportedly suggested some form of deal was made, but that's an author statement rather than canonical text, and the primary sources themselves use language that signals uncertainty. What can be said is that the lore consistently places the Emperor's relationship to warp power at a level where even the Ruinous Powers treat him as a peer-level actor in the immaterium, not merely a talented user of forces they control. Set the contested details aside. The confirmed catalog of what the Emperor demonstrably built tells the essential story. The Golden Throne wasn't originally a life support mechanism. Its function as a device sustaining the Emperor's dying body was imposed by necessity when Magnus the Red's sorcery breached the webway wards during the heresy, forcing the Emperor to abandon the project and remain bound to the throne or lose Terra to demonic incursion. Before that, the Golden Throne was built as an interface for something else entirely. The Lexicanum records the original design purpose directly. The Emperor built the throne as a means of entering the webway, a means of providing human access to the Eldar network of immaterium-free travel lanes beneath real space. Since the original webway was built of psychically resistant material that humans couldn't replicate, the Emperor used his own powers, channeled through the Golden Throne, to protect the human-built extension from the warp. His consciousness as an active barrier, substituting for Xeno's construction materials his own craftsmen couldn't produce. The stated goal was unambiguous. Having this fixed point of entry was meant to free humanity from its reliance on warp ships and astro-telepathy, since humans could simply enter the webway and emerge wherever they chose in the galaxy. Read that fully. The Emperor's explicit strategic purpose for the single most ambitious engineering project in human history was to make warp travel obsolete. The tens of thousands of workers he sent through the portal, the armies of red-robed Mechanicum technicians building kilometers of new tunnel beneath the Imperial Palace, the absolute secrecy maintained even from the Primarchs, all of it in service of a project designed to rout human civilization around the warp entirely. He didn't want to master the warp. He wanted humanity to not need it. The Astronomicon represents the other side of the same philosophy, a psychic beacon projected across 50,000 light-years of galaxy, maintained by his consciousness sitting on the Golden Throne, powered by the daily sacrifice of 1,000 psychers. A single mind broadcasting guidance across a significant fraction of the Milky Way. The Astronomicon doesn't exist because the Emperor wanted humanity dependent on warp travel and simply improved the navigation. It exists as a stopgap, an emergency measure for a civilization that needs to cross interstellar distances while the Webway project was being built. The Webway, once complete, would have made even the Astronomicon unnecessary. Every major strategic undertaking of the emperor's final centuries before the heresy converges on the same vector: reducing, routing around, or defeating the warp's hold on human civilization. The Sister of Silence program against chaos influence. The Webway project to eliminate warp travel. The Golden Throne to maintain human access to immaterium free lanes. The Astronomicon as transitional infrastructure. This isn't a collection of unrelated projects, it's a systematic campaign. Now consider what building 20 warp soul entities required him to understand. To engineer a Primarch, to individually bind warp content to a biological substrate with specific warp presences incorporated for at least some of them. 20 different configurations of the same fundamental mechanism, each adapted to a different physical and psychological template, requires complete technical knowledge of how warp essence bonds to biology at the most fundamental level. The Emperor needed to understand the mechanism of warp soul attachment well enough to do it reliably, repeatedly, and with precision, 20 times from 20 different starting points. Understanding how warp essence bonds to biology is precisely the knowledge required to understand how to engineer biology that resists or prevents that bonding. The same technical framework describes both the process and its inverse. A craftsman who can build a lock from scratch knows, by definition, exactly how to build a door with no lock receiver at all. Not a lock that can be picked, but a door that the locking mechanism can't interface with at any point. The Emperor couldn't engineer the pariah gene from scratch. The lore is clear that even M41 technology couldn't artificially isolate or replicate it, and experiments in that direction had been catastrophic. But engineering the pariah gene from scratch was never the requirement. The requirement was to select for it in an existing human genetic baseline. Identify individuals in whom the gene expressed strongly, the same process used to build the Sisters of Silence, and then apply to that baseline every technique the Emperor had developed for Primarch-level biological architecture. Build all the physical mass, cognitive capacity, physiological enhancement, and leadership potential of a Primarch around a template that was chosen precisely because it was constitutionally incompatible with warp soul binding. Not a Primarch with the warp component removed, a Primarch-class being constructed from the beginning on biology that never had the capacity to receive one. The Sisters of Silence were the proof of concept. Select for the pariah gene, amplify through genetic and institutional development, deploy the resulting individuals as a weapons class. The Null Primarch would be the Sisters of Silence methodology taken to its logical terminus. The same selection principle, the same exploitation of blank biology as the foundational architectural choice, scaled to Primarch-class physical and cognitive specification. Every stage of that process was within the Emperor's documented competence. None of it required him to combine incompatible mechanisms in the same vessel. It required him to build an entirely different kind of vessel and never introduce the warp component that would have made it self-contradictory. The paradox the objection identifies: Primarchs are warp entities. Blanks have no warp presence. Therefore, a null Primarch is structurally impossible, is a real paradox in one specific design space, the standard Primarch design philosophy. Build something with a warp soul and then try to make it blank. The two mechanisms destroy each other. That's correct. But the objection assumes the Emperor had no other design space to work in, and the Sisters of Silence prove otherwise. The alternative methodology was already operational, already institutionalized, already classified under his personal authority, and running for decades before any of this became relevant. The 2nd and 11th Legions were subjected to a damnatio memoriae, a formal condemnation of memory, the deliberate destruction of all records, symbols, and monuments pertaining to the condemned. The Lexicanum describes the execution of this erasure as the most successful edict of obliteration ever carried out in imperial history. Not one of the most successful, the most successful. every record destroyed, every symbol removed. Other Primarchs had their memories of the lost brothers actively wiped, not allowed to fade over time, not simply discontinued from discussion, but surgically extracted from the minds of 20 demigods whose cognitive capabilities dwarfed anything normal human neuroscience could approach. In A Thousand Suns, when Magnus starts to reference a gathering of Primarchs and inadvertently gestures toward the memory of missing brothers, Mortarion cuts him off immediately, invoking the Emperor's direct command that the subject be dropped. Active enforcement of silence, ongoing, enforced by direct Imperial command decades after the relevant events. The first heretic establishes that by the time of the word-bearer's formal rebuke at Monarchia, at minimum 43 standard years before the Dropsite massacre at Isstvan V, the Imperial record listed only 18 legions. The 2nd and 11th were already gone by then. They didn't fail at Isstvan. They were gone long before the heresy gave the Imperium its catastrophes to cover. In the short story The Lightning Tower, Rogel Dorn stands in the halls of the Cath Mandau precinct of the Imperial Palace before a series of pillars bearing statues of the Primarchs. 2 plinths are empty. Dorn reflects that the 2nd and 11th plinths had stood vacant for a long time, that no one ever spoke of those 2 absent brothers, that their separate fates had seemed like aberrations, and wonders whether they had, in fact, been warnings that no one had heeded. Tragedies, aberrations, not crimes being punished, tragedies being mourned, not tools discarded, but brothers grieved. In Deliverance Lost, Corvus Corax is reunited with the Emperor after years apart and asks about his missing brothers. The Emperor's expression grows bleak, filled with deep sorrow. He looks away when he answers, "The other 2, that is a conversation for another day." Deep sorrow, not contempt, not the dismissiveness of a creator describing a failed prototype. Sorrow, and a reluctance to discuss it even privately with a son he had just been reunited with. In The Unremembered Empire, Rabute Gilliman builds a chamber on Macragge with 21 chairs, 1 for each Primarch and 1 for the Emperor, and he drapes the 2 chairs belonging to the missing brothers with blank pennants of plain, bleached, undyed cloth. When the Lion notices them, Gilliman says that their absence must be marked, that places must be left for them, that it is simply honor. In Vulcan Lives, when Vulcan considers whether to report the darkness he has perceived in Conrad Kurz to other Primarchs, he tells his equerry that none of them wants another sanction, another empty pillar in the great investiary, another brother's name excised from all record, that it is shame enough to bear the grief for 2. Grief for 2. The emotional register across all these sources is consistent and worth noting precisely. The loss of the 2nd and 11th is treated by every Primarch who references it as grief and sorrow, as the loss of brothers, not as embarrassment over a disgrace or relief that a dangerous failure was contained. Sanguinius's reference to the empty plinths in Fear to Tread links them to genetic failure as a mechanism of disappearance, which suggests one framework for understanding what happened. But genetic failure that produces grief at the Primarch level, extraordinary institutional suppression at the Imperial level, and an Emperor who won't discuss it even in private with a son he hasn't seen in years. That pattern points somewhere specific. A failed experiment gets buried in the standard fashion. A successful experiment that can't be allowed to be known gets the most successful damnatio memoriae in Imperial history, active mind wipes of demigod-level witnesses, and an Emperor who responds to the subject with sorrow rather than shame. This is inferential reasoning, and it should be presented as such. The sorrow could have other explanations. The completeness of the erasure could reflect the severity of a disgrace rather than the sensitivity of a success. The evidence here doesn't prove the Null Primarch. It's a supporting beat, not the argument. But the emotional register and the extraordinary thoroughness of the suppression together point toward concealment rather than burial. towards something guarded rather than something shamefully disposed of. Some theorists argue the blank theory applies more naturally to the second Primarch rather than the 11th, primarily based on a lore hint connecting the second's operational region to the Imga monolith, a Necron artifact. The suggestion is that the second may have been converted into a blank state through Necron technology, rather than through any Imperial engineering program, a process separate from the Sisters of Silence methodology and potentially predating it. No canonical source resolves this. The lore entry for the 11th Primarch confirms only that he existed, was scattered like the others in infancy through a warp vortex, and has no recorded name, world, or fate. The Bolter and Chainsword Forum has noted that the official timeline places the discovery of the 11th later in the sequence than the second, which means the 11th was lost to records during a period when the Emperor's blank warrior program was already institutionalized and operational. If the Null Primarch represents the apex of that program rather than a Necron-mediated conversion event, the later timing of the 11th's disappearance fits the developmental arc of the Sisters of Silence better. But there's no canonical trump card here. Pick either plinth. The metaphysical argument runs identically for both, and the mechanism being proposed doesn't depend on the Legion's number. Return to the objection at its strongest formulation. A Primarch can't be a blank because Primarchs are warp soul entities by definition. Everything demonstrated above accepts that as accurate. Primarchs are warp soul entities. Blanks have no warp presence. Combining them in the same vessel under the same design philosophy produces a structural contradiction that destroys the warp component, and therefore destroys the Primarch. All of that holds. The objection's precision isn't the problem. Its error is the conclusion it draws from that precision, specifically that the Emperor therefore couldn't have built a Null Primarch. What the evidence suggests instead is that the Emperor would have had to build a Null Primarch through an entirely different methodology, not combining incompatible systems, but selecting for a biological substrate constitutionally incapable of warp soul binding at the foundational level, then constructing all of the physical and cognitive architecture of a Primarch around that substrate, never introducing the warp component in the first place, building from blank biology up rather than from warp entity down. The Sisters of Silence methodology extended to its logical limit. Now think about what such a being represents strategically in the context of the heresy. The Chaos Gods corrupted 11 Primarchs. 9 turned before or during the heresy. 2 were already gone. In every case where a Primarch became accessible to Chaos, the access came through the same structural feature, the immaterium presence that made them perceptible, trackable, and eventually reachable across centuries of patient, subtle manipulation. Lorgar's theological wound was a warp-level vulnerability. Magnus's pride was exploited through the same channel his sorcerous gifts operated on. Angron's agony resonated in the immaterium in ways that made him legible to Chaos from the moment of the Butcher's nails. Each corrupted Primarch became reachable through a different psychological vector, but the physical access point was always the same, the warp-bright soul that Chaos could perceive and work through. One Primarch with a null constitution had no access point at all, not stronger psychological defenses. Those didn't save the others, and they wouldn't have saved a blank Primarch if Chaos had a way in. Not superior willpower or loyalty so pure that Chaos found no purchase. Architecture. There was no warp presence to corrupt, no soul to taint, no immaterium bright signal to follow across the galaxy, no resonance to exploit over decades of slow pressure. Not a locked door. No door whatsoever. That property makes a Null Primarch strategically valuable in ways nothing else in the Imperial arsenal could replicate. Every conventional Primarch is legible to Chaos, present in the immaterium, visible in the way that powerful warp-touched beings are visible, capable of being perceived by entities who experience the entire psychic landscape of the material universe as an open book. The Chaos Gods built their entire strategy for the Primarch project around that consistency. Every Primarch shone in the warp. Every one was reachable, given enough time and the right approach. That was their certainty, and they spent 200 years of the Great Crusade exploiting it. One Primarch wasn't there. In warp terms, simply absent. Not a stronger target, an absent one. Couldn't be found through the mechanism that gave chaos access to everything else. Couldn't be modeled. Couldn't be slowly worked on. Couldn't be perceived in the way that perceiving a Primarch required. Not invisible in any conventional sense. Visible in real space. Physically present. Commanding a legion. But in the dimension through which chaos understood the battlefield and worked its longest operations, as invisible as the dead. Think about what that legion represents on a chaos-heavy front. A military force that moves without giving the immaterium a signal to track. A Primarch-level intelligence and leadership capability. The organizational genius, the physical capability, the ability to coordinate forces at strategic scale, paired with complete constitutional imperviousness to the primary vector through which chaos took half the other legions. Not through military defeat, through decades of patient influence operating through the warp-bright nature that made the Primarchs what they were and what they couldn't stop being. The Calexis assassin established that blank energy can be weaponized as a directed projectile. Pariah missiles established it can be delivered at orbital range. The Sisters of Silence established that a blank warrior force of significant scale can be maintained for millennia under direct imperial authority, classified, deployed against chaos across multiple conflicts, and returned to reserve when the strategic situation changes. The trajectory across those three data points runs in one direction, from individual blanks to battalion-level deployment to orbital delivery. The Null Primarch would be the terminus of that trajectory, not an outlier in the logic, but its fullest expression, the point at which the Sisters of Silence program scaled to its maximum possible output. And if it worked, if the Emperor actually built this and it functioned as designed, then the operational security requirements would exceed anything else he had protected. The strategic value of a weapon the Chaos Gods can't perceive depends entirely on the Chaos Gods not knowing it exists. The moment information about it escaped into the warp, into the dreams of psychers, into whispers carried by demon emissaries across the centuries between the Crusade and the Heresy, the advantage would begin eroding. The Ruinous Powers would adapt. They would find approaches that didn't rely on the warp perception they used to track everything else. The Edict of Obliteration was the price of that advantage. The most successful damnatio memoriae in imperial history, thorough enough to survive 10,000 years with only scattered accidental fragments preserved in administrative documents. The mind-wiped Primarchs, memories of a brother surgically extracted from 20 demigods rather than simply discouraged from conversation. The scratched-out symbols Malquador noticed on the door of the original Primarch laboratory, brushed aside with the comment that no one went in there anymore. The grief in the Emperor's expression when Corax asked about the other two. Not shame, not contempt, not the dismissiveness appropriate to a failed tool. Grief. The particular sorrow of someone who built something real and extraordinary and had to ensure that no one could ever find out what it was or where it was kept. The objection says the paradoxical nature of the Null Primarch is the barrier to belief. The incompatibility of warp soul and blank constitution is where the argument stops, because that incompatibility is structural, not evidentiary. The thing can't exist within the established rules of what Primarchs are. 3 counters dismantle that barrier at escalating levels. Blanks exist in canon as an institutional program the Emperor personally managed from the Great Crusade's earliest decades. The Sisters of Silence prove his operational engagement with warp negation at scale wasn't incidental, but central to his greatest secret works. Scale limits don't apply in the setting. The shadow in the warp proves warp disruption at civilizational scale is possible even as an unintended biological byproduct with no engineering behind it. The Emperor's mastery of warp soul binding was deep enough to engineer 20 distinct warp entities with individual warp constitution profiles, which is precisely the technical knowledge required to understand and deliberately invert the mechanism. But the fourth response is the one that closes the argument. The impossibility is the point. A weapon that appears structurally impossible within the rules of what Primarchs are is the only weapon that an enemy who understands those rules perfectly can't account for. The Chaos Gods knew the rule. Every Primarch shines in the immaterium. Everyone is reachable through the warp. Their entire strategy for the Great Crusade and the Heresy operated on that certainty. A Primarch who violated the rule wasn't just a powerful adversary. It was a thing they couldn't see, couldn't model, and couldn't plan around, precisely because it shouldn't exist. The objection called the paradox evidence against the theory. The paradox is the design specification. That's the reason it was built. And that's the reason no one was allowed to know. Subscribe for more stories like this.